It had been a long, exhausting day. I felt it in my bones as I walked through the front door, the weight of a full day's work pressing down on me. Peter, my husband, was away again on another business trip. His frequent absences had become almost routine. His absence didn't bother me as much anymore. It had become part of life. But tonight, the silence in the house felt different. Usually Noah, my stepson, was holed up in his room, lost in his own world of video games or music. But tonight, there was an unsettling stillness that hung in the air, a quiet I couldn't quite shake. I kicked off my shoes by the door, the cold floor of the hallway sending a small shiver up my spine as I walked toward the kitchen. The house seemed bigger when Peter wasn't around, even though it wasn't all that large. It was a modest home, but it had its charm, even if I didn't always feel like it was entirely mine. The kitchen lights flickered to life as I reached for the cabinet to grab a glass of water. I wasn't thirsty, but the motion gave me something to do, something to occupy my thoughts. Noah's room was down the hall, and I could hear the faint hum of music playing through the walls. But it wasn't the usual upbeat rap or rock he listened to. Tonight, it was something softer, quieter, almost melancholic. My steps slowed, and I hesitated for a moment before I made my way to the living room. The soft light from the lamp in the corner lit up the space just enough for me to notice the darkened edges of the room, the shadows creeping in as the evening wore on. I wasn't sure what it was, but there was something about tonight that made me feel like I was walking on eggshells. The usual hum of our daily lives seemed to have dimmed, and instead, I felt this heavy undercurrent in the air. I could sense it in Noah too. He hadn't said much all day, not even a simple hi when I came home, and that wasn't like him. He was usually so quick to greet me, his shy smile or playful quip about the day's events. But today, nothing. I glanced at the clock on the wall. It was almost 10. My body ached from the day's work and I was ready to curl up in bed, but that unease gnawed at me, keeping me from relaxing. I took a deep breath, trying to shake it off. It's just a mood, I told myself. Maybe it's just the weight of the week catching up with me. But then I heard it. A soft knock at my bedroom door. A slow, hesitant tap, as if Noah was unsure whether to disturb me. The sound pulled me out of my thoughts, and I found myself standing there for a moment, not quite sure what to do. I wasn't expecting him. We'd long since settled into a routine. He had his own space, and I had mine. I had no reason to think anything was wrong, but that knock, it had a different feel to it. "Yeah?" I called out, my voice softer than I meant it to be. I couldn't hide the curiosity that crept in, though. The door opened just a crack, and I saw Noah standing there in the dim light from the hallway. His usual confident, if distant demeanor was gone. He seemed almost fragile, like he was carrying something he didn't know how to say. I can't sleep," he mumbled, his voice low and almost timid. There was a shift in the way he said it, something unspoken, a crack in the armor he usually kept so carefully in place. My heart tightened in my chest. Noah had always been a quiet kid, not one to easily open up, but this was different. "Do you want to talk about it?" I asked before I could stop myself. My question lingered in the air between us, an invitation and a hesitation all at once. I wasn't sure what I expected him to say, but I could tell that tonight wasn't going to be like any other night. Noah didn't answer right away. Instead, he stood there, his shoulders hunched, almost as if he was trying to figure out whether to stay or leave. His eyes avoided mine, and I felt that familiar pang of helplessness. What was I supposed to do for him now? I wasn't his mother, and yet, I was, in a way, the closest thing he had to one. His real mom hadn't been in the picture for years, and Peter and I had only recently married. Still, Noah had always kept me at arm's length, his walls high and thick, built from years of abandonment and hurt. I understood that. I really did. But tonight, I felt something different, something raw. I just feel lost sometimes, he finally said, his words barely a whisper. Like I'm just here. I don't know where I fit anymore. I let out a quiet breath, the weight of his words hitting me harder than I expected. Noah had always been the strong, silent type. Even as a teenager, he rarely shared what was on his mind. But this was different. I could feel it in the way he said it, in the way his voice trembled ever so slightly. I nodded and stepped aside, the gesture simple but meaningful. You can stay with me for a bit if you want. Just come in, okay? Noah hesitated for a second, glancing at the empty space in my room, before he walked in. The door shut quietly behind him, and I watched as he sat on the edge of my bed, not quite knowing where to put himself. I could feel the tension in his body, the way he fidgeted with the hem of his sleeve as if trying to distract himself from whatever it was he needed to say. I sat down beside him, not saying anything at first, just letting the silence stretch between us. He didn't immediately speak again, but the air felt charged now, heavy with things unsaid. I didn't push him. Sometimes it was enough to just be there. So I stayed quiet, offering him the comfort of my presence, even if I didn't know how to fix things. I wasn't sure what he needed, but I was here. And that was enough, for now. The room was still save for the soft hum of the fan in the corner. I had just settled into bed, my body already sinking into the comfort of the cool sheets, when I heard it again. That knock. This time it was louder, more urgent. I hesitated for a moment before I called out, my voice a little too sharp in the quiet night. Yeah? I said, trying to keep my tone light, even though I could already feel the shift in the air. Noah didn't respond at first. The seconds stretched out, and I could hear him hesitating on the other side of the door. He always knocked before coming in, but tonight, the knock seemed different, more uncertain. After a beat, the door creaked open, and I saw him standing there framed by the hallway light. His posture was rigid, his usual sense of control missing. The tension in his body was obvious, even from where I lay. Can I talk to you? Noah asked, his voice barely above a whisper. He didn't step inside, as though he wasn't sure if he should. I sat up a little, the sudden shift in his demeanor pulling me out of my sleepy fog. Something was off. He'd never asked to talk to me like this before. Of course, I said softly, motioning to the space beside me on the bed. I could tell he was uncomfortable, unsure how to bridge the gap between us. It wasn't uncommon for him to be distant, but tonight, the distance felt heavier, as if something was gnawing at him from the inside. Noah took a few slow steps into the room, his eyes avoiding mine as he sat down at the edge of the bed. He didn't look at me directly. Instead, his gaze seemed fixed on the floor, like he was searching for something to say that wasn't quite coming. I waited, not wanting to rush him. Noah had always been quiet, but there was something about tonight that made me feel like there was more going on beneath the surface. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. I didn't press him, knowing that sometimes silence was the only way to get to the heart of things with Noah. I could feel him beside me, though, his discomfort radiating off him in waves. I could tell that whatever was troubling him, it wasn't just the typical teenage angst or rebellion. This was deeper, something he was struggling to express. Finally, he shifted, pulling his legs up to sit cross-legged on the bed, but still keeping a noticeable distance between us. He sighed heavily, almost like he was trying to find the words he needed. I don't know what's wrong with me, Noah muttered, his voice rough like he hadn't spoken in hours. I just can't sleep, can't seem to do anything right. He glanced at me quickly, and I saw the vulnerability in his eyes, something I wasn't used to seeing. I feel like everything's just off, like I'm not supposed to be here. I could feel the weight of his words like a heavy stone sinking into the pit of my stomach. It wasn't a typical teenage complaint, the usual, I can't sleep or I'm bored. This was something much deeper, something that went beyond the usual discomforts of being a teenager in a blended family. It was clear that Noah was wrestling with something inside him, something he couldn't quite articulate. Hey, I said softly, turning to face him more directly. I reached out, placing a hand on his shoulder, a small gesture meant to offer reassurance. You're not alone in this. I know things have been hard, especially with Peter traveling so much, but I'm here, Noah. Whatever's on your mind, we can figure it out together. He didn't look at me right away. Instead, his eyes stayed trained on the floor, his fingers tapping lightly on his knee. For a brief moment, I wondered if I was doing the right thing, offering him comfort when I wasn't sure what he really needed. But then, he spoke again, his voice barely audible. "It's just, I don't know if I belong here. With you and Peter, it's like I'm always the third wheel." He swallowed hard, his voice cracking just slightly. "I'm always outside looking in, and I don't know how to fix that." I felt my heart tighten at the rawness of his words. I hadn't realized how deeply Noah had been carrying this sense of isolation. I knew the transition from being an only child to having a stepmother and a father who was often gone wasn't easy for him, but hearing him put it into words made the reality hit hard. "Noah," I said gently, squeezing his shoulder for emphasis, "you don't have to fix anything. It's okay to feel like that. It doesn't mean you don't belong. I'm here, and Peter, he loves you. You don't have to have it all figured out right now." For a long moment, Noah didn't respond. The silence between us felt heavy, but not in an uncomfortable way. It was the kind of silence that comes when two people are sharing something unspoken, when the words aren't enough to convey the full weight of what's being said. I could tell that Noah was still processing everything, his own feelings, the confusion he was dealing with, and maybe even his place in this family. He started again, but his words trailed off. He was still lost in his own thoughts, his emotions swirling in a way that made him seem younger than he really was. And for the first time, I realized that Noah was struggling not just with fitting into this family, but with fitting into himself. "You don't have to say anything right now," I said softly, giving him the space he needed. "But I'm here. If you need to talk, or even if you just need to sit with someone, I'm here." Noah nodded slowly, the tension in his shoulders easing just a little. There was a long silence after that, the kind that only happens when people are processing something big. Neither of us spoke, but I could feel the air between us shift slightly, as if we had crossed some kind of invisible line. He didn't have to say anything else for me to understand that tonight, something had changed. The silence in the room felt almost suffocating after Noah's last words. He still wasn't looking at me, and I could tell his mind was working overtime, processing everything he had just shared. I wanted to say something else, something to make him feel better, but I didn't want to force words out that weren't truly helpful. Sometimes, the best thing you could offer someone wasn't advice or reassurance, but just your presence. So I waited. It wasn't until the sound of his deep, almost reluctant breath broke the quiet that I knew he wasn't done talking. Noah shifted, his legs uncrossing as he moved closer, sitting now at the very edge of the bed. The distance between us was small, but it felt like a mile. The air was thick with something I couldn't quite place, vulnerability maybe, or maybe just the weight of unspoken words. "I've been thinking a lot about it," Noah said, his voice quieter than before, like he was speaking more to himself than to me. He cleared his throat, the sound jarring in the stillness. "I don't think it's just about fitting in with you and Peter. It's something more." I looked at him, trying to make sense of what he was saying, but he still wouldn't meet my eyes. His gaze dropped to his hands, fidgeting with the hem of his sleeve. There was a heaviness in the way he was carrying himself, like he was bracing for something. "I feel like everything's slipping away," he continued, voice barely audible now. "Like I'm losing myself. I don't know who I am anymore." His words hit me like a punch to the gut. I wasn't sure if it was because I could hear the rawness in his voice, or because the uncertainty in his eyes made me realize just how deeply he was struggling. It wasn't just about his place in the family. It was about his sense of identity, his connection to himself. And that was a much harder thing to fix. "Losing yourself?" I echoed, trying to understand. "What do you mean?" Noah exhaled sharply, like the question itself was almost too much to answer. He ran a hand through his hair, then dropped it into his lap, eyes darting around the room before landing back on his hands. "I don't know," he said, shaking his head, frustrated with himself. "I just feel invisible. I used to know who I was, but lately it's like everything's changing, and I don't know where I fit anymore. I don't know if I belong anywhere." I could hear the confusion, the desperation in his voice, and I felt a pang of sympathy for him. Noah had always been the quiet one, the one who kept to himself, but this felt different. There was something more to it, a layer of pain I hadn't fully realized he was carrying. I leaned in slightly, my voice softer now, trying to offer some comfort in the midst of his uncertainty. Noah, I know things have been tough, but I want you to know something. You do belong. You belong here, with me, with Peter. We're a family, whether it feels that way right now or not. His eyes flickered toward me for just a moment, but the vulnerability I saw there made it hard for me to hold his gaze. It was like I was seeing a part of him that had been hidden away for so long, and I wasn't sure what to do with it. I know it's just, I can't help feeling like I'm in the way sometimes, he confessed, his voice cracking slightly. He wiped his face with his hand, as though trying to hide the emotion. Like I don't fit in with you guys. I'm just a piece of the puzzle that doesn't belong, and I don't even know if I want to try anymore. His words stung, though I knew he didn't mean them to hurt me. I could hear the self-doubt in them, the pain of not knowing where he stood. It was so clear now. Noah didn't just feel out of place in the family. He felt out of place in the world, like everything around him was shifting, and he had no control over it. I took a deep breath, the weight of his confession settling in my chest. I had known Noah was struggling, but this was a different kind of hurt, and I had no idea how to help him navigate it. Noah, I said, my voice steady despite the wave of emotion I felt building in my throat. It's okay to feel like this, but that doesn't mean you're alone. You're not a piece of the puzzle that doesn't belong. You belong here just as much as anyone else. And if you don't feel like you fit in right now, that's okay too. We're not going anywhere. We're in this together, all right? There was a long pause, and for a moment I wondered if my words had reached him at all. But then, Noah finally looked at me. His expression was unreadable, but there was something different in his eyes, something softer. Thanks, he whispered, his voice barely above a breath. It wasn't much, but it was enough to let me know that, for the first time, he truly understood that he wasn't alone in this. And maybe, just maybe, that was a step toward finding himself again. The morning came much too soon, and with it, a sense of unease that refused to dissipate. I woke up to the soft light filtering through the blinds, and for a brief moment, everything felt normal. The house was still quiet, and Peter's absence seemed to hang in the air like a subtle ache. But then I remembered Noah, and the conversation we'd had the night before came rushing back. I lay there for a while staring at the ceiling, wondering how things had changed so suddenly. Last night had been raw, more than I'd expected. Noah had opened up to me in a way he never had before, and I'd tried to comfort him the best I could. But now, in the light of day, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted between us. It wasn't just the vulnerability he had shown. It was the way I had responded, the warmth I felt as he spoke, how his pain seemed to draw me in closer, almost in a way I didn't know how to explain. I pushed myself out of bed, but the thoughts lingered. They clung to me, wrapping themselves around my mind, making it hard to focus. I needed to get up and get moving, to start the day and pretend that everything was fine. But it wasn't, and I knew it. When I went into the kitchen, Noah was already there, sitting at the table, staring at a bowl of cereal as if it were the most important thing in the world. He didn't look up when I walked in, and there was a tension in the air that hadn't been there before. I made myself a cup of coffee, trying to keep my hands steady. The silence between us felt heavier now. The normal rhythm of our morning routine, me making breakfast, him grumbling about getting up early, was gone. The usual distance that we kept from each other had been replaced with something else, something unfamiliar, a closeness that felt different. And not just in the way he had talked to me last night. It was in the way he sat there now, with his shoulders hunched, his gaze avoiding mine. It was in the way my own heart seemed to beat a little faster when I looked at him. It was like we were both dancing around something neither of us could name. "Good morning," I said, my voice a little too bright, trying to cover the awkwardness. Noah didn't respond right away. He just nodded, then finally glanced up at me. His eyes were tired, more tired than I'd ever seen them. The weight of everything that had been said the night before hung between us, and I could feel it, heavy and unspoken. "Morning," he muttered. I tried to focus on making breakfast, but it wasn't easy. Every sound felt too loud. The clinking of the spoon against the bowl, the sizzle of the pan. It all seemed so off. I couldn't escape the sensation that something had changed between us. And it wasn't just Noah's confession. It was me too. The way I was looking at him now, the way I was feeling, was different. And that thought unsettled me more than I cared to admit. As I placed a plate in front of him, I noticed his eyes flicker to my hand for just a moment. The briefest glance, but it sent a jolt through me. I wasn't sure if he'd noticed it, but I sure had. The way he was looking at me wasn't like before. It wasn't the look of a distant stepchild, but something more intense. And that, more than anything, made my stomach twist in knots. Are you feeling better? I asked, trying to keep the conversation light, trying to push away the heaviness in my chest. He gave a half shrug, as if he wasn't sure how to answer that. I guess. A little, but it's hard, you know? I nodded, my throat tight. I know, I said softly, I understand. But as I said it, I wasn't sure if I did. I didn't know what it meant to feel this way, this new dynamic between us, this subtle shift in how I saw him. It was like something inside me had clicked into place in a way I didn't know how to handle. And as much as I tried to push those thoughts aside, I couldn't ignore the truth that had settled inside me. The truth that said things had changed, and there was no going back. I moved to the counter, my back to him, as I tried to steady myself. The room felt too small, too close. Every time I turned, I could feel his eyes on me, the weight of his gaze pressing into my skin. And it wasn't the usual look he gave me, a stepmother's look of respect, of distance. It was something deeper, something that made my skin prickle and my heart race. When I turned back, I caught him looking at me again, this time with a little more certainty in his eyes. I didn't know what that meant, but it made my pulse quicken. I wanted to say something, anything to break the tension, but I couldn't. The words didn't come, and in that silence, I realized just how much had shifted. The rest of the morning passed in a blur of half-spoken sentences and unacknowledged glances. I could feel the tension in the air, thick and unyielding. And as I went through the motions of the day, I couldn't shake the feeling that everything had changed. Something unspoken had settled between us, and it was only a matter of time before it would surface. The day passed slowly, the mundane activities of life taking on an almost surreal quality. Each task I performed, preparing lunch, folding laundry, responding to emails, felt distant, as if I were performing them from behind a foggy window. The weight of last night's conversation, of the subtle changes between Noah and me, clung to me like a second skin, impossible to ignore. Noah, too, seemed different today. He wasn't the same boy who had barely spoken to me when Peter and I first got married. The Noah I'd known had always kept his distance, not just physically, but emotionally. He'd been the typical teenage boy, retreating into his world, avoiding anything too personal, anything that might force him to be vulnerable. But now there was an unspoken understanding between us, an invisible thread that kept pulling us closer even when neither of us was ready to acknowledge it. He stayed close by, lingering near me more than usual. When he walked through the room, he'd pause just a little too long, as if waiting for me to say something, anything. It wasn't obvious. He wasn't making a spectacle of it, but I felt it. He seemed to be drawn to me in a way that felt different. The silence between us felt heavy with things unspoken, emotions neither of us was prepared to deal with. I caught him watching me a few times throughout the day, just a glance here and there, nothing overt, but enough to make my stomach flutter in a way I didn't want to admit. There was a softness in his eyes, a curiosity that hadn't been there before. His gaze wasn't judgmental, but it wasn't neutral either. It was like he was studying me, looking for something in me that I wasn't ready to share. And the way I felt about him, the way my pulse quickened every time our eyes met, was beginning to unsettle me more than I cared to admit. When we sat down for dinner that evening, the tension was palpable. The clink of silverware against plates, the sound of chewing. It all felt too loud, too sharp. I tried to keep my focus on the food, tried to ignore the awkward energy between us. But every time Noah shifted in his seat or reached for his drink, my attention would snap to him, drawn by something I couldn't name. His presence was suffocating, but not in a way that made me want to push him away. It was more like he was a magnet, pulling me toward him whether I wanted to be pulled or not. I stole a glance at him across the table. His eyes met mine, and for a moment, neither of us moved. The air seemed to thicken, and I could feel my heart racing in my chest. There was something unspoken, something that neither of us dared to say out loud, but it was there, hanging in the space between us, something that neither of us could ignore. "So, how was school today?" I asked, forcing myself to break the silence. "Fine," he muttered, not looking up from his plate. "Nothing special." I nodded, but the conversation felt forced, artificial. I could sense the tension in his shoulders, the way he held himself just a little too rigid. He wasn't engaged in the conversation the way he usually was. He wasn't making his usual sarcastic comments, wasn't retreating into his phone. Instead, he sat there, tense and distant, his attention flickering between his food and me. It was like he was trying to read something in my face, trying to understand the new dynamic between us. But whatever he was looking for, I didn't have the answers. I pushed my plate aside, unable to eat. The weight of the silence between us had settled too deeply into my chest, and it made my stomach turn. Every time Noah shifted in his seat or met my eyes, I couldn't help but wonder what he was thinking. Was he feeling the same thing I was? This strange mix of confusion, desire, and guilt? Or was it all just me? I kept my eyes fixed on my plate, unwilling to look up for fear of what I might see in his expression. But I couldn't help myself. I looked, and when I did, Noah was staring at me again. His gaze not as fleeting as before. There was something in his eyes now, something searching, almost desperate. It was a look I wasn't used to, a look that sent a chill through me. And in that moment, I realized just how much had shifted between us. The rest of the evening passed in a blur. We finished dinner, cleaned up in silence, and went our separate ways. I couldn't shake the feeling that something unspoken was hanging over us, that the relationship we had was now irrevocably altered. And as I lay in bed that night, unable to sleep, I couldn't help but wonder what would happen next. Would things continue as they had, or had this shift between us opened the door to something neither of us could escape? I didn't know, but I knew one thing for sure. I couldn't ignore the tension any longer, and neither could Noah. The week seemed to drag on in a haze of awkward glances and unsaid words. Noah was around more than usual, though he didn't make any obvious moves to change things between us. He wasn't overtly trying to be close, but somehow he always ended up nearby, lingering just on the edge of my personal space. The air between us was thick, charged with something neither of us could fully explain or confront. One night, as the clock ticked past 9 p.m. and the house quieted down, Noah appeared at the edge of the living room, hesitating for a moment before speaking. "You want to watch a movie?" His voice was softer than usual, as if he didn't quite know how to ask, or maybe he was afraid I might refuse. I looked up from the book I'd been reading, my eyes meeting his, and for the briefest moment, I saw something flicker in his gaze, an uncertainty, an invitation maybe. "Sure," I said, trying to sound casual. The words came out too quickly, as if I were eager for some kind of distraction from the tension that had been building between us. He walked over, and we sat down on the couch, me at one end and Noah at the other. It was supposed to be a normal evening like any other, but as the minutes passed and we got comfortable, I realized how acutely aware I was of his presence. The couch, which had always felt big and spacious, now felt cramped. We were too close, yet not close enough to escape the undercurrent of tension that seemed to hum between us. I settled back into the cushions, trying to focus on the movie, but I couldn't ignore the feeling that Noah's eyes were on me. Every time I glanced over, he was staring at the screen, his jaw tight and his expression unreadable. I had no idea what was going on in his mind, but there was an intensity to his silence, a stillness in the way he held himself. It was like he was waiting for something. As the movie progressed, I felt him shift slightly closer, though he didn't touch me. His leg brushed mine by accident, and I couldn't help but flinch, my body tensing involuntarily. The touch was brief, nothing more than a casual accident, but in that moment, it felt like the entire world had shifted. I quickly pulled my leg back, though it wasn't like I had anywhere else to go. There was nowhere in the world I could escape this tension. I wasn't sure if he noticed my reaction, or if he was just pretending it didn't happen. But my heart was beating a little faster now, and I could feel my palms growing sweaty. "Sorry," Noah muttered under his breath, his voice barely audible over the sound of the movie. I could tell he was embarrassed, but I wasn't sure if it was because of the accidental contact or the growing unease that had started to linger between us ever since that night we'd talked. His words were quiet, but I heard them clearly, and something about them made my chest tighten. I glanced at him, but he was already looking away, his focus now entirely on the screen. I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. What could I say? "It's fine," seemed too dismissive, and saying anything else would have drawn unnecessary attention to what had just happened. So I sat there in silence, feeling the space between us closing in. Each passing minute felt more oppressive, the air around us heavy with a tension I couldn't shake. The rest of the evening passed in a blur of half-hearted conversations and brief silences. When the movie ended, Noah got up quickly, almost too quickly, and I did the same. We both seemed eager to escape the awkwardness of the moment, like we could somehow outrun what had just passed between us. But as I watched him head upstairs, I couldn't help but feel the weight of that subtle shift, that unspoken closeness that had built up between us. Was it just me? Or had the distance between us been erased without either of us realizing? There was something almost magnetic about his proximity now. It wasn't physical, not entirely. It was a mental thing, an emotional thing, that neither of us knew how to handle. And I wondered if this was something I was willing to confront, or if I would continue to run from it, pretending it didn't matter. That night, as I lay in bed, the darkness felt suffocating. I thought about Noah, about the way he'd barely touched me but had still left an imprint on my skin. The heat of his presence, just a few inches away, lingered with me long after he was gone. And I knew, with an unsettling clarity, that something had shifted. And the strange thing was, I didn't know how to fix it, or if it even could be fixed. But one thing was for certain. The distance between us was gone, and now there was only the closeness we both seemed to be unable to avoid. The days following that evening felt like walking through a fog. Every time I caught Noah's eye, there was a flicker of something deeper there, something unspoken, but neither of us dared to acknowledge it aloud. It was as if we were both waiting for the other to say something, to break the silence that hung between us, but neither of us knew where to start. He started lingering around me even more, sometimes standing in the kitchen while I prepared dinner, or hanging around while I was doing laundry. It was subtle, but it was there, this silent pull, an understanding without words, and I couldn't ignore it, no matter how hard I tried. I could feel his presence more intensely now, like a quiet pressure that hovered just beyond the line of what was comfortable. His eyes followed me more than they ever had before, though always quickly shifting away when I noticed. I couldn't help but wonder if he was feeling the same disquiet I was, or maybe he wasn't, and this was all in my head. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted irreversibly. There were moments when I caught him looking at me, his gaze lingering just a little too long, and I would turn away, my heart racing, hoping he didn't see the flush that crept into my cheeks. We never talked about that night, or about what had happened between us since. It wasn't something we could easily bring up, not without acknowledging the tension that simmered underneath every conversation. It was in the way we spoke to each other, a little more carefully now, and the way we moved around each other, just a little bit more aware of the space between us. But even in the silence, there was a mutual understanding. I couldn't explain it, but I felt it in my bones. It was as if we both knew that something was happening, but neither of us was brave enough to name it. So we continued on, side by side, pretending that everything was fine, even though it clearly wasn't. It was as if we were both holding our breath, waiting for the moment when one of us would finally exhale, let it all spill out. But neither of us moved, neither of us dared to. And I couldn't help but wonder if this was how it was always going to be. Silent acknowledgement, with no resolution in sight. A week had passed since that uneasy evening, and the air in the house was thick with the tension we'd both tried so hard to ignore. The casual moments, like sitting at the dinner table or watching TV together, felt different now, fraught with a new kind of awareness. It was like we were both walking around this invisible line, afraid to cross it, but also afraid not to. I knew that Noah was aware of it too. It wasn't just me. The way he held himself around me, the way his eyes would linger a little too long, it was also painfully obvious. But we never said a word. Not about the distance that had closed between us. Not about the growing weight of it all. We just lived in it, and it felt like the only thing that remained unsaid. That afternoon, I found myself alone in the living room, lost in thought, the house eerily quiet for once. I stared at the walls, feeling the weight of everything I hadn't said, everything I couldn't say. I wasn't sure what to do with all the feelings that had been building up inside me. I had been avoiding looking too closely at them. But now, as I sat there in the stillness, I couldn't help but acknowledge that they were there, undeniable. The door creaked open and I turned to see Noah standing in the doorway. He didn't say anything at first. He just stood there, watching me, his expression unreadable. For a moment, I wondered if he was waiting for me to say something, waiting for me to make the first move. Finally, he stepped into the room, his hands shoved deep in his pockets. I was thinking, he started, his voice low and hesitant. Maybe we should talk about everything. My heart skipped a beat. I had been waiting for this moment, in a way, but now that it was here, I felt completely unprepared. The words I had been holding on to, fears, confusion, everything, were suddenly too much to process in that moment. But I knew I couldn't keep ignoring it forever. Yeah, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. We probably should. He nodded, his eyes meeting mine for the first time in what felt like forever. We stood there for a long moment, neither of us moving, neither of us knowing what would come next. But in that moment, I realized that the silence had been broken, and that was something at least. The tension between us hadn't disappeared, but now it was something we could face together, something we had to face. What would happen next, I couldn't say. But I knew one thing for certain. Whatever path we walked from here on out, it would be different. We had crossed an unspoken line, and the only thing left now was to figure out what that meant. And as I stood there, facing Noah, I knew that the resolution didn't have to come in words. It came in the shared understanding, in the acknowledgement that we had both felt this shift, and that we were no longer pretending it didn't exist. The road ahead was uncertain, but at least now it was ours to walk together or apart.